Hey, you're listening to True North Truck Thought, or the Triple T Pod for short. It's a monthly podcast hosted by Scopelitis Transportation Consulting and brought to you by TrueNorth Companies. In each episode, Steve Keppler and I will take a deep dive into all things trucking, like what's new in government and research, as well as some practical and theoretical discussions on issues like the role of the independent contractor, reducing risk within your business, and how to adapt to this crazy supply chain. Our carefully selected panel of industry experts get to the bottom of the most challenging and controversial issues facing the industry today. So, without further ado, I'm Sean Garney of Scopelitis Transportation Consulting.
And I'm Steve Keppler. Welcome to the show.
Great. Awesome. Well, hey, Steve, welcome back, man. I'm really excited about the conversation we have in front of us today. It's been about a month since last we met in this forum, and I think this is going to be great. Did you have a perfect turkey day full of rest and safety?
I did, and yeah, plenty of naps. That I think we tend to overeat. Thanksgiving, I think that's part of what it's all about, right? So naps and the World Cup soccer and football and lots of family time. So hopefully everyone else. And I want to give thanks to John and Dan for joining us today. So thank you.
For sure. Well, Steve, while you were sleeping, our nation's truck drivers were delivering goods. And as a topic that, of course, we always share here is safety. And one of the ways that we like to look at safety is through the data, because understanding what the data says provides us with super important business intelligence that makes us safer and more competitive. And there are lots of organizations doing important research on challenges and opportunities facing the trucking industry, but few are led by industry practitioners, right? Like the American Transportation Research Institute, or ATRI. ATRI is an independent research organization whose study priorities are guided by a board of directors and a research advisory committee that's comprised of trucking company executives, industry suppliers, and industry associations. You know, I used to work for the American Trucking Associations. Of course, we have lots of ties, Steve and I, with researchers around the country. And I think one of the things that challenges researchers sometimes is how to maintain relevancy, right? Like, how do I study the things that are going to make an impact? And I think ATRI is an organization that has no problem maintaining this relevancy because they're studying things that are so important to our industry. And so with that, I'm super excited to introduce our topic today, which is one of ATRI's most recent studies called Predicting Truck Crash Involvement, released in October. It's the fourth iteration of this study, and it works to link specific behaviors with the propensity of future crash risk. And also very excited to introduce Dan Murray. Dan Murray is a senior vice president of ATRI. He comes to the industry with 26 years of broad-ranging experience in transportation fields, including trucking research and economics, transportation safety technology, on autonomous vehicles. So welcome, Dan, to the show. Trust you had a good Thanksgiving.
Well, thank you, Sean. Thank you, Steve. It's great to be here. I had an awesome Thanksgiving, and every time the Vikings win, it gets better and better.
Oh, man. And they beat the Patriots, so woohoo, we like that one, too.
So, and a dirty secret, I'm at 28 or 29 years of experience, but I just decided if I don't update my bio, maybe I won't age.
Yeah, I think that's working out for you. So good news. Well, also joining us from True North today is John Biblis, Senior Safety and Loss Control Specialist. John joined True North in 2020 and brings with him 25 plus years of trucking experience, unless, of course, I did the math wrong, which is entirely possible. Thanks for joining us, John, from I understand, a client facility, kind of doing double duty today. So appreciate you taking the time out of your day. Hope you had a good Thanksgiving, and maybe your football team won. I don't know.
Yeah, well, my football team didn't win, but I had a great Thanksgiving. I'm with Steve. I took a bunch of naps. Didn't realize how tired you could get doing nothing. But it was good, and I'm excited to be here. I've read the study several times, all 63 pages of it, and I've heard Dan talk and give a summary. So I'm real excited about digging into this topic.
Awesome. Well, thanks. So let's dive. I think just to echo Sean's points, Dan. I personally was served on the research advisory committee for 7 years, and unbelievable value it provides to the industry. Kudos to all the work you all do at ATRI. It helps a lot of folks. So thank you for that. So let's kind of start at the top of the funnel here. Maybe if you might talk a little bit about the purpose of the study and what information ATRI is trying to illuminate with the work.
Yeah, no, happy to do that, Steve. In fact, I think you were on the Research Advisory Committee when it first selected the Crash Predictor Report back in, 2005 or 6 or something. And the big argument by the Research Advisory Committee, we call it the RAC for short, was that there was a fair amount of research linking carriers to safety. But at the end of the day, to be candid, the driver sort of has the last out, has the last level of liability, makes the last decision before, during, or after a crash. And so they said, maybe we need to start looking at the relationship between the driver and the safety data, which is what we did. And we had unique access, and still do today, to a database that's not out there in the public domain, but it does provide us with well over 500,000 unique truck driver records, whether it's the CDL data, whether it's crash data, violation citation data, et cetera. And what we did is we found some very savvy ways of using different statistical tools to link and relate the driver history, or driver behaviors as we nickname them, which is again citations, violations, convictions, with their historical crashes. And by doing that, you can then do sort of predictive analyses looking forward, painful stats, chi-squares, regression analyses. But essentially, it links with great statistical validity the relationship of things on a driver's MVR with future crash probability.
So, without wanting to get into too many sort of painful statistics, as you say, because I do find great pain in complicated statistical analysis.
And you are a math whiz, by the way.
I could barely add up 2 and 2 at this point. I have to call Steve just to, divide two numbers. But, one of the things that interests me about this study was that you talked a little bit about the strength of the relationship between a driver's behavior and the propensity for future crash risk, right? And you talked about how there was a dip in 2011, and then 2018 saw a sort of a return to the strength of that relationship. So I'm wondering if, well, first of all, did the 2022 study demonstrate that same strong relationship? And how would you explain a dip in the relationship between driver behavior and future crash risk?
Well, and it's complex because the statistical tools we use are mostly correlations. What is the strength of the relationship between a crash and, say, a reckless driving conviction? It doesn't tell you why that relationship exists. There's a classic, correlation does not imply causation. And essentially, there's a lot of mystery still in the numbers. They are extremely reliable and valid at 95 and 99% confidence levels. You can go to the bank on this stuff in terms of the probability statistic, but exactly what's causing it, you sort of have to bring industry experience and even some intuition to it. For instance, you can look at the different types of events or behaviors. Failure to obey traffic signal, 55% increase in future crash probability. Well, we know as an industry and as individuals, a failure to obey traffic signal is running a red light. And underlying that might be everything from an attitude of I was distracted, or I had something better to do, or there's nobody around to catch me, so why not just blow the light? So that's where, folks like you guys can come in and help the industry, carriers, drivers, insurers, to understand what sort of strategies would eliminate that behavior and thus reduce by 55% future crash probabilities for drivers that have that on their record.
Yeah, I love that. We're going to dive into a conversation, I think, a little bit later about how specifically we use the information because I do think that's going to be important. Can you talk a little bit? You talked about this sort of non-public data set that you use, but can you talk a little bit about what data you relied on for the study and why it's important? I think there's some important nuggets in there.
Yeah, well, again, it's just a rambling list of, we have inspection data, we have SIDless data, we have crash data, we have MVR data. Some of it's public, MICMIS, of course, is public. Some of it's not. SIDless data, much of that is sort of protected under privacy protections, et cetera. So we had access to it, and we ran, again, these statistical analyses. But, it would be a great disservice to the trucking industry if I didn't caveat our research with this statement, which is the vast majority of crashes involving a car and a truck are not caused by the car driver. The original stat was FHWA found out 71% of the time the causal factor was the car driver. Transport Canada separately did that. Coincidentally, 71% of the time. AAA Foundation literally said, hey, our members are not that responsible. They did their own analysis, found out 75% of the time the car driver is primarily responsible. And then safety advocates came out and said, well, a lot of times the car driver is deceased and you can't interview him. So the University of Michigan did an analysis with just injuries and property damage, and 68% of the time. The only reason I'm telling you that is if we get to a point, whether it's data queues or something else, where we could take out the crashes from the data set where the truck driver truly had no negligence, our statistical analysis would be 3 or 4 times more accurate and powerful. We have a lot of noise built in because the crashes are still in there when the car driver is responsible. But if we could take the noise out, you'd see exponential increases in the strength of a future crash likelihood based on what's on a truck driver record. So I just wanted to throw that out because I think that's an important caveat.
No, I think that's important to share, Dan. I think, and before we jump into the study results, one other thing on the data, I think to me is important that I wanted to bring to light, that a lot of carriers don't necessarily pay attention to as much as they should, is you guys don't just look at conviction data, you look at violation data.
Right.
And so, and a lot of fleets are just using MVRs as their measuring stick. Right. And so that's what the regulations require. But I think expanding, and convictions, as a data set is much smaller than violations as a data set. So I think maybe talk for a little bit about that, the difference in what the data shows there.
Sure.
I also just want to say, just for everybody listening, violations, a synonym for violations among drivers is often warning. Okay. They think it's a warning, but it's still a violation. So I just wanted to make that, before Dan jumps in, just want to make that distinction.
Yeah, and frankly, there's even a difference between a violation warning and a violation, unfortunately, which irks the heck out of folks, but it is what it is. Or with data, it are what it are. But you're absolutely right about conviction, Steve. In fact, I think you were still over at CVSA when we passed a federal law saying you can no longer negotiate away charges. If you're cited for speeding, you're either innocent or guilty of speeding in the court. You adjudicate it that way. You can't negotiate. It can't become faulty equipment. But based on the data we see in our report, we think that the difference between the strength of a conviction, say a speeding 15 over posted, and a violation or citation of that, it's still very different, which tells me at a courtroom level, things are still happening regardless of the federal law. And we think it's probably just ignorance of FMCSRs by judges, probably. Yep. But there is something happening where, in theory, the strength of a citation should be equal to, even though there'll be more of them, because some people are going to be found innocent, but the strength should be much closer to a violation / conviction than it is today. They're very, very different, as you can see in the list. So we think something's still going on in the courtroom, but our research doesn't really comment on that, other than you definitely can see the differences between convictions and violations.
Yeah, and I think. Oh, sorry, John. Go ahead.
Well, no, just staying on that line for just a second. I wanted to revisit the crash preventability, Dan. We've had this crash preventability program for a couple of years now. Do you think that in 3, 4, 5 years, when you revisit the study, that some of the crash data will be cleaned up and we'll have a little bit more accurate information?
Well, Christmas is coming, and that's been on my wish list for many years. There's no question, particularly at the state level, the data coming in has issues. And we've known about that for a decade or more. Sometimes the data is missing. Sometimes it can't be mapped clearly. Some of that, unfortunately, is law enforcement on the roadside not really understanding FMCSRs and even the trucking industry. So I'm hopeful that over time, John, things definitely improve, but I don't think that's going to be happening overnight. We've been working on it for a decade.
Yeah.
We can't even standardize police reporting. Not that many years ago, we did a study on rear end crashes, and in 23 states, you could not tell who rear-ended whom. Radically different strategies depending on who's rear-ending whom, but it would be a checkbox for a car, checkbox for a truck, checkbox for a rear-end crash, and that data is useless to us at that point. So
Sure.
It's not uncommon for the data to have, well, if you're an optimist, just let's say huge opportunities for improvement.
Yeah, let's drive down this path for a little bit, because I think it's an interesting one. I agree with everybody here that a large portion of our crash challenge in the trucking industry is dealing with the casual motorist. Couldn't agree more. But I want to ask you, Dan, at the same time, like if I look at the 4 analyses over the last 4 years, a past crash was the number 7 highest likelihood to increase future crash probability in 2005, second in 2011, fifth in 2018, and third in 2022. So clearly past crashes are indicative of future crashes, right? Like, how do we square that circle here? Because you hear that a lot in the CSA context too, where FMCSA and their researchers will say, well, look at, and insurance too. They'll say, any past incident is, elevates your likelihood in the future. So how do we square that circle?
I'm glad you asked it. We do see, violations floating up and down along with crashes. Most important, probably in the report, which I don't have all 4 memorized, page by page, but in this newest 2022 report, we give you 4 or 5 of the events, behaviors that are in the top 5 among all 3 or 4 reports. So those are ones you sort of can take to the bank. They're at the top of the list in 3 or 4 analyses, mostly even 4 analyses. So the strength of those is there.
Mm-hmm.
And then the other thing, which I want to comment about the various reports, is when you look at, say, the top 25, they'll float up and down a couple line items in the list, but not much. And so, this list in total is a very important blueprint for us as an industry. If we're going to care about crash reduction, which is so important right now because crashes are ticking up and we don't even know why, this is the list we need to focus on, the total list of top 20, say 25. And the reason I say that is both ATRI and the DOT Office of Inspector General has lambasted the agency for having 400, 500, 600 FMCSRs on the book, rarely removing any. And at the end of the day, the vast majority of them, as the Inspector General said, don't relate to safety. So officially, you have to be in compliance with, cleaning up oil on the floor of the terminal. But if you're trying to reduce crashes, you better focus on the top 10, 15, 20 crash predictor behaviors, because that's the only thing that's going to reduce crashes in the future.
It's interesting you say that, because I've advocated for that for a while. If we remove some regulations, we'll actually increase safety. So maybe that's a good segue. Maybe and I think picking up on, so this year's results, what did they show, and what are the key takeaways from your perspective?
Well, as Sean was kind of zipping through a few of those, Number one issue, failure to yield right-of-way violation, 141%, more than a doubling of future crash probability. Failure to use signal, past crash, reckless, of course. I'm going to go out on a limb and say, I've had so many carriers talk to me about, well, am I supposed to terminate these drivers? The number one issue for motor carriers 6 years in a row is the driver shortage. And they say, Dan, are you telling me I'm supposed to terminate any driver that has any of these on their MVR? And I say, no. Two things. If you don't have these on a driver's MVR, develop proactive training to make sure they don't show up and you avoid the crash probability. If you have a driver who's got any of this on their historical MVR, then develop reactive remedial training to essentially wipe out the possibility of that behavior having an impact. The one exception to that is I see reckless on an MVR, and that one is just egregious enough that as a carrier trying to avoid litigation, I might consider termination for a reckless. But everything else seems to indicate in related research that you can mitigate or eliminate the future crash probability with solid training.
Hey, Dan, I'm glad you got to that because you just kind of jumped to the end and what I was hoping we were going to talk
does that
about.
Does that mean we're done, John?
Oh, no.
Thanks. Have a good day, everybody.
but now we get to the meat of it, and I guess we'll go backwards in a second. But I think it's so important that the motor carrier has takeaways from this discussion, right? And you hit it right on the head. I mean, how do we continue to support drivers that are not having these events, right? And number two, what do we do to support drivers that have had them to coach this behavior away from them in the future? So, things like cameras come into play, I think, in a big way. And the study didn't really address this, but I think having cameras, identifying risky behavior, at the same token, at the same time, identifying this behavior on MVRs, sitting the driver down, having that kind of coaching session to say, hey, you've had these events. This is where you stand statistically to have a new accident. We want to help you not do that. And, to me, that is so important and something that many motor carriers that we see just aren't taking the time to do.
Well, and I think that's a good point, John. When we work with a number of suppliers in the industry too, and I know you mentioned cameras, and a number of the camera providers actually incorporate ATRI's work into their algorithms, right? And so if you're a carrier, you should be asking your providers, are they doing that? How are they using this information to help them in identifying these risky behaviors that out on the road and notifying you as a carrier that you can take that immediate action, not wait till the MVR, right? Yep. Take that immediate action. How do I correct it? How do I, coach that driver? And how do I use that information kind of more globally within the carrier as part of their training program and ongoing safety meetings with drivers and the like?
Yeah, I think the very first step, and it is Safety 101, coming out of our crash predictor research, is that a violation is not a violation is not a violation. They are highly unique, highly customized, requiring very disparate approaches. Again, you see the data and you discover there's dramatic differences in crash probability based on what the violation is. So you do have to do some mining of the MVR. You can't just say, well, they've got 3 violations. In and of itself, that's meaningless. So that's one thing. The second thing that Steve touched on that's so important is advanced driving systems, advanced driver assistance systems. They don't care who's negligent, particularly if it's a car driver. They just stop the crash. And so advanced driving systems need to be the way of the future for us as an industry. The other thing, though, you both mentioned cameras. In January, we have a pretty in-depth analysis coming out on driver-facing cameras as they compare to road-facing. Truck drivers today love road-facing cameras. They hate driver-facing cameras, and there's so many different models, always on, capturing 20 seconds of critical event. But the research also includes the litigation component. We work closely with the defense bar on how the data, the video feeds are used, not used, what they like, how long they should be stored. So we'll have a lot more insight for you in January, but no question at the end of the day, technology in the cab is going to be more beneficial than not. And there's just a learning curve with some of those technologies and driver preference.
That is going to be awesome. I can't wait for that research. We've spoken to so many carriers about, inward and outward facing cameras and the benefits or drawbacks of each of them. One of the ways we're talking about, and this is the meat and potatoes, right? This is what we really want to talk about. What does a carrier do with all this information? And Dan has a little insight on this because ATRI has also done sort of a nuclear verdict study, right? And one of the ways that I see carriers using this is to justify decisions that they're making, right? About what are my hiring guidelines? What are the types of events that I'm focusing on right now from a training perspective, right? Like, how do I drive down that unsafe driving behavior sort of basic score or whatever else? And so I've definitely spoken with a lot of carriers, and they say, well, how do I know how to build, I'm a new carrier and I need to build hiring standards. What do I look at? Well, there's lots of information out there in the form of research. And this study is one of those where you can say, well, okay, I know that a failure to yield the right-of-way violation increases future likelihood the most. And so I'm going to look at my current drivers and I want to train on that. And I want to look at drivers that I'm considering hiring and maybe put that on the list of specific violations. To your point, Dan, just saying, hey, I'll accept up to 3 violations on the MVR or whatever your case is. That's less helpful, right? Especially, pertaining to this particular research, because
Sure.
who knows what you'll see on it. And what it actually started with, we talked about this at the top of the program. Just this morning, I looked at an adjudicated violation that was adjudicated from speeding to improper it was an equipment violation, a broken speedometer. So now they weren't speeding, their speedometer was broken. I'd be curious to know what the police officer thought of that, considering, they were probably radar along the way. But thoughts on using your research in that way too, to sort of protect yourself or insulate yourself from plaintiff's bar?
Yeah, the litigation is ugly, as you know from our research. And 2 anecdotes I can share with you, and I'll make them short. One is a well-known defense attorney in the trucking industry came up to me after our first or second report and said, you realize you made my job so much tougher in the courtroom because you just told the trial attorney what to look for. And I went back and shared that with one of my ATRI board member motor carrier executives who happened to be, let's call him the customer, the client of the attorney. And I told him the story, and he said, if I proactively apply the crash predictor information, I don't have the crash, and then I don't have to pay the attorney fees to go to court. The second thing that's extremely important for you to know, because I just learned this in the last couple months, while our research has been used by the trial attorneys, the plaintiffs, no question, we also found out that the defense bar can use the same thing to say, yes, you say that the ATRI study shows our driver was quote unquote dangerous, and we knew it and we continue to employ him. But what you don't realize is we sent him through 22 hours of remedial training on failure to yield, and on paper that should mitigate or minimize the crash probability effect. So it probably wasn't that, because we reacted proactively. If you can imagine that. And the court on paper, the jury on paper will say, you know what, the carrier was a good carrier because they attempted to do something about it. And so the defense attorney told me that was very effective in being able to show and document paperwork, literally, how many hours of remedial training the truck driver received to mitigate that crash behavior. And I think that's a powerful message, which means you can stay out of court, but if you go to court, you still have, some hope of responding.
Well, and I think that's a good point, Dan. And that's when we talk to carriers, we mention that, stay proactive. And I think, as we've talked about, crashes are very complicated events, right? And so, to the extent things, you have research based findings that you can use for decision making, that certainly strengthens your case for sure.
Yeah, certainly the mere presence of information doesn't indict a carrier. right? It's information is power. It's what are we doing with this information that can play to our advantage, right, John?
No, that exactly right. The whole idea is to intervene on the behavior. I think one thing that just caught my attention is Dan used the example 22 hours of remedial training, and my question, I guess, that I'm mulling around right now is what's reasonable, right? I mean, we need to act as a motor carrier in a reasonable manner. Is it 2 hours? Is it 8 hours? Is it 22 hours of remedial training, if that's the word we're going to use? And I don't know that we're going to answer that question today, but
I can tell you, John, that we will not answer that question today. But you know what? It's because we don't have the research and the data on that.
Yep.
We would have to have a very robust sample of different training regimen and then what the safety outcome was. We did that with entry-level driver training, but in terms of relating sort of training responses to the crash predictor behaviors, that data does not exist today.
Well, tell us, Dan. Oh, sorry, Steve. Tell us, Dan, a little bit. I want to press into this topic a little bit. You talked about your entry-level driver training research. Can you give us sort of the high level on the effectiveness of training in
Absolutely.
general?
And Sean, you know this. All of our research is on our website, free of charge, truckingresearch.org. You'll have to go back, I think, a good 4 to 5 years for the entry-level driver. But we did look at the safety outcomes. We went and got the safety data for the drivers and the carriers after they received a series, sort of a different regimen of training. And we looked at what had the greatest impact. And surprisingly, different types behind the wheel, classroom, roadside, et cetera, they all had different strengths in terms of safety benefits. The single strongest safety benefit from training was accident reconstruction, accident response training. And it had a huge benefit. The more of that, the safer the driver was. And we can only hypothesize that you are walking them through real world crash scenarios and how you have to respond, how you have to put, flares out, how you have to, call 911, whatever it is. I think it made a crash so real for them. It wasn't like a textbook scenario. It was like, oh my gosh, this could really happen. And the effect of that was strongest in terms of the safety data. So that's just my teaser for you to go grab the report and take a look at on the website.
Well, I think that's a lot of it is education and awareness. I think, John, to your point, to me, I guess what I would say to your question is to me, the most important thing is not once you deliver training, don't set it and forget it.
Yep.
Right. Don't just assume that it's taken effect and that the driver has learned and changed their behavior. Because everybody learns differently. Right. So I think part of it is having an ongoing strategy for how you're evaluating that driver's performance and what's going into that evaluation and assessment, and having a two-way feedback with the driver to let them know that you're there to support them and help them become better and safer. They're part of the safety success of the company. And so I think it's not a hard and fast rule. It's very individualized. So I think, again, to me, it's just don't just set it and forget it.
And Steve, I just want to say a second really important reason that it has to be repetitive and redundant is truckload carriers, as an example out there today, who have the lowest driver turnover, they're still at 70%. So you have to be so repetitive, not just because you're developing customized solutions for truck driver Dan Murray, but because truck driver Dan Murray might not be there in 2 months, and now you're dealing with truck driver John. So the need for repetition and redundancy is partially related to the turnover. You've got to keep this going so that every driver consistently has the strategic and customized training you're describing.
Yeah, such a good point, given driver churn, that if I train truck driver Dan Murray today on, the dangers of speeding, and he's gone tomorrow, Steve comes in 3 weeks from now, and I'm not scheduled to talk about speeding for another 6 months, then then we've sort of we have a system failure there. So that's
No, you're right. And I have to
that's
warn
really
you that the idea of even training speeding out of Steve Keppler, it's highly unlikely.
That-
yeah, that is a true story. That is a true story. Awesome. Well, this has been a great conversation. We've got about 5 minutes left. I appreciate that John brought us right to those takeaways, which I hope we'll reiterate before the end. But one of the things I wanted to ask you just a little bit about is that this study has sort of some fun sort of sundry analyses, right? Some extra things that you just decided to ask some questions to the data and see what it turned up. Of course, they come with caveats about the significance of the relationship and that sort of thing, but thought maybe I'd toss it over to you to tell us whether or not women are better drivers than men, or whether or not roadside enforcement is effective, or whatever types of things you'd like to offer us as sort of some fun takeaways.
Right. I think there's three things. The first one you just mentioned, which we've known for years, we sort of re-corroborate, but other research has documented that traffic enforcement is 4 to 5 times more effective than random roadsides. I'm not saying get rid of random roadsides, but it's a little bit looking for the needle in the haystack compared to traffic enforcement, where a driver is being yanked for some very deliberate reason. So that was one thing that, again, we just sort of revalidate that. But the other two things that I think are extremely interesting is women, we say, among the truck driver population are somewhere between 6 and 8%. But when we looked at the inspection data, hundreds of thousands of inspections, we found out women were only 2.7% of the drivers being pulled over, or at least inspected. And so we thought, the hypothesis, well, they're working for safer motor carriers. So we pulled CSA data and crash data for the motor carriers they're working for. And believe it or not, they're working for slightly less safe motor carriers. And then we looked at other things. Maybe they're driving cleaner, newer trucks and getting waved by more often. And we found out that's not it. Ultimately, what it came down to is the number of women truck drivers who have Class A, let's just call it over-the-road driving, is much, much smaller than males in their ratio of their gender to the population. So what we have to do is we have to convince more women who have Class B and Cs to give Class A driving a shot, long haul over the road, and then they'll show up on the interstates and the national highway system and get inspected more often and get up there. But it does tell us that women truck drivers are really, really small percentage of the total truck driving population when you're looking at over the road. The last thing, which is really controversial, is we had enough data to be statistically significant among 18 to 20-year-olds, and their mean crash rates were lower than what we'll all say are at least older, if not more mature veteran drivers, 25 plus. So the fear in the data that 18 to 20-year-olds are just going to be danger on the road doesn't pan out in the data that we analyzed. So it does give some support to FMCSA's program to consider 18 to 20-year-olds in an interstate driving environment. I think that's a huge opportunity. Both those are huge opportunities to address the driver shortage issue.
Yeah, I think that's interesting, and we'll of course see how FMCSA's program develops and what the results of those are. Of course, we're so far away from making a significant change in that space, but certainly important that researchers like yourself are asking those questions, are providing that data. I remember that fight from years ago with ATA and everybody always pointing to data that says the younger you are, the less safe you are. And I'm not arguing that, my 16-year-old daughter is likely less safe than a very experienced car or truck driver, but a professionalized workforce is an entirely different thing. So we'll have to see how that goes. Well, we're kind of coming up on time here. I think it's been an awesome conversation. I wanted to provide each of you an opportunity for some sort of parting shots. We're not going to call them shots, but some advice, getting back to John's important question about what should we do with this research. And for Dan, I'd also like to ask you, what FMCSA's interest in this research has been. And this type of thing could really inform CSA scoring and the like. So for you, I'd love to ask that. And for Steve and John, I'd love to just, if you could provide a little bit of perspective on what you think carriers should do with this information.
Sure. So I think traditionally, and this is the RAC response from when Steve Keppler was on it, is FMCSA has designed their entire safety program around motor carriers. I mean, granted, there's truck driver CSA scores, but they're unknown. CSA scores, ISS scores, everything is built around the motor carrier. And I think the crash predictor says that we can make improvements by getting right to the source of at least roadside behavior, and that would be the truck driver. Not an indictment at all on the truck driver, but we're all eager to effect change in the crash rates that we're seeing. So clearly the driver is sort of the end consumer of safety opportunities, and that's where the crash predictor comes in. So I would urge every motor carrier to do something short of a comprehensive safety audit, maybe not short of it, where you look at, who are my drivers? What are my most important crash types? I'll tell you really quickly, based on insurance industry data we have, rear end crashes and rollovers are two of the most expensive crashes out there. They oftentimes alternate. And you need to see what sort of crashes you're having. You'll see a preponderance of certain types if you're in rural versus urban areas, and then develop those strategies based on your safety data, not generic stuff out in the marketplace, but a customized analysis of an individual carrier. And I'm going to put one last soapbox in here. With a new $100 billion infrastructure bill in play and work zones showing up every 22 feet in the next year or two, I'm very concerned about rear end crashes because, again, it's one of the two most expensive. More than 1 in 4 work zone fatalities involve a large truck. And so we need to start planning immediately how to minimize rear end crashes because the work zones are coming and we are overrepresented in those work zones. So that's my one little soapbox I wanted to add.
Awesome. Thanks, John. Thoughts on how our carrier friends out there listening or our driver friends should be looking at research like this?
So I think my number one takeaway is that my thoughts on driver engagement has matured a little bit during this conversation. I think that when we identify a driver who has had one of these events and we want to address it, it's not addressing it today and moving on. It has to be an ongoing process. So maybe we bring in that driver that's had a failure to signal a lane, and we provide some coaching, some training for them, but it can't stop there. We need to revisit that in 3 months, 6 months, a year from now, to continue to support that change in behavior.
Fantastic. Yeah. Steve, any thoughts on the party shots question?
Yeah, I think John mentioned it earlier on that one of the things carriers are continually concerned about is how do I get new drivers in and how do I maintain what I have, and they're sometimes can be reluctant to be over their backs or in their face, right? Because they're worried about that, and that's a legitimate concern. I get it. But I think to me, that's the value of research because you take the emotion out of it, right? And we have, incredible results of a very significantly statistical analysis study, and you can present that to your driver. Say, look, this isn't us saying this. This is what the data shows. We want to help you. We're here to help. And so, and that help can take through, multiple ways. And we've talked about a number of them here. So my challenge is to the carriers that are listening to this, figure out how you can help those drivers because they want that help. They want to be safe. So let's find out how to help them and let's do it.
Yeah,
absolutely, Steve. Great point. I mean, if we approach it that we're helping the driver, not punishing them by making them do this training, but we're helping you to become a safer driver so you can go home to your family, it goes well, right? And that shouldn't be a barrier to recruiting drivers. I mean, it should be an attraction.
Fantastic. Thanks, Steve. Thanks, John. Couldn't agree more. I think that, the trucking industry is a very busy place. and there's a lot of fires that lots of people are putting out. But some of the questions that carriers are asking have already been answered by great organizations like ATRI and others. And so, keeping our eye on the prize, figuring out, what the research says will help inform and improve our safety of our operations. So thanks so much to everybody today on the pod. Dan, as always, thanks for your time. John, appreciate you being here. Steve, you're the man. You want to roll us on out of here?
Sure. Thanks, Sean. And thanks for listening to this episode of True North Truck Thought. If you enjoyed the topic today and want to tune in for future conversations here on the Triple T Pod, make sure to follow us. Also, please don't hesitate to let us know which topics you want us to cover in future episodes. Drop us a line in the comments section or send us an email to transportationnews@TrueNorthCompanies.com. Thanks, everybody. Thanks, John, Dan, Sean. Great time today.
Been a pleasure.
Appreciate you.
Yep. Thank you all.